Thank you.
I'd like to begin by asking you what significance does the Birmingham story, the Birmingham struggle that has just been concluded, have, in your view, on the overall Negro white struggle in the United States?
Well, I think it has great significance in that Birmingham has been, for many years, the symbol of hardcore resistance to desegregation. And I would say it has been the toughest city in the country in race relations. It's been the most thoroughly segregated city in America. It has had a terrible record of police brutality, and there have been more unsolved bombings of Negro homes and churches in Birmingham than any other city. Now, in the movement, in the particular movement that took place, I think we were able to dramatize the indignities and the injustices which Negroes confront in Birmingham and other places in the hardcore South. And by doing this, I think we were able to bring the issue so much to the surface that everybody could see it. And after we reached the point of getting basic agreements from the economic power structure, I think it said to people all over that the barriers or the walls of segregation are crumbling in Birmingham and they can crumble anywhere. By tackling the most difficult city, it seems to me that we were able to give impetus to other movements and say to people everywhere that it's just a matter of time now.
I wonder if you believe, Dr. King, that the Birmingham issue, the Birmingham violence, was the specific trigger which has set off the explosions around the country, north and south. Was its violence, the attack on children, the use of police dogs and police truncheons, were those the triggers that have ignited Englewood, New Jersey, and other southern communities and other northern communities more than any other incident to date?
Well, I think it's a combination of two things. I think on the one hand, the large number of people who engaged in the demonstrations had something to do with it. In fact, more people were arrested for standing up for civil rights in Birmingham than any other city in the country. Some 3,200 were arrested. So I think the mass quality of the movement had its arousing effects and its repercussions in other communities, along with the indignities of the brutality and the violence perpetrated against Negroes. I think these two things arouse Negroes all over the country and all people of goodwill for that matter. And I'm sure that things that are happening in other communities, north and south, at this very time, to a large extent came into being as a result of the mass quality of the movement in Birmingham and the violence perpetrated against Negroes.
Dr. King, subsequent to the Birmingham situation, we have read a lot of behind the scene maneuvering of Kennedy and Mr. Burton Marshall. How effective was our Justice Department, and specifically Mr. Kennedy and Mr. Marshall, in effecting a final resolution in Birmingham? You were on the scene. You were the pivot of the action. How effective were they?
Well, I would say that they were quite effective in at least making it possible for us to have open channels of communication. We had not had any real dialogue prior to the coming of Mr. Burton Marshall. We had made some approaches and some attempts had been made to open negotiations, but it never got off the ground. And I do think that with the coming of the Justice Department and Mr. Marshall in the picture, some channels of communication opened that wouldn't have opened as soon. Now, I'm sure they would have eventually opened because of the persistent power of those engaged in the movement. But I think it helped to bring it about earlier.
Were they, in your view, Dr. King, late in anticipating the extent of the violence? Were they delinquent in getting there soon enough?
Well, I think they could have gotten there sooner. All along, we had called the Justice Department, called to the attention of the Justice Department many of the things that were taking place that were symptoms of grave injustices, and we had many things happening. And in fact, the whole process we felt was a tragic deprivation of basic constitutional rights, and we constantly called these to the attention of the Justice Department.
How
And
did they respond?
at first, they said that there was nothing that they could do because constitutional questions were not involved. At least the Attorney General did not have the power, the legislative power, the power backed up by the legislative branch of government to move in. The Attorney General has the power to move in and initiate suits in the area of voting rights when denials are made in that area, but they contended that they had no power in the other areas. And it went on like this until things started getting out of hand in terms of the violence on the part of the police force. And this is when they came in the situation.
I wanted to ask you, in your view, is the Negro community of the United States aflame as never before? And is the suspicion or the fear of some that we are on a collision course between the impatience of the Negro and the procrastination of the white community? Is that fear well grounded?
Well, I think there is no doubt about the fact that the Negro is more determined now than ever before to be free. I think that is a discontent in the Negro community, a frustration and an impatience, if we can use that word, that we haven't seen before. I've been around the country for the last few days speaking for freedom rallies, and I don't think I've ever seen the Negro population of our nation more aroused and more determined as I've seen on these particular trips. And I think it has reached a point now that there will be no stopping point short of justice and freedom. And I think the great challenge ahead is for the people of goodwill to see that the Negro is through with tokenism, through with gradualism, and through with see how far you've comeism. And he's determined now to gain these basic rights, which have been guaranteed by the Constitution and God-given rights, and yet they've not been carried out. It really grows out of blasted hopes, because we all responded to the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 with a great sense of hope. This came to us as a great beacon light of hope. And yet after 8 years or more, we've come to see that integration has moved about 1% a year, students a year. And moving at this pace, it will take 92 more years to integrate the schools, public schools of the South. And then outside of the South, we see de facto segregation growing every day. The ghetto continues to exist. And the endless frustrations that develop as a result of economic deprivation and social isolation will naturally cause the kind of discontent that we now have in the Negro community. And I think it is colliding with another force that must ultimately give and recognize the urgency of the moment.
Do you fear that if the pace of desegregation and integration is not sufficiently swift, that violence is inevitable and that your own nonviolent movement may be overridden by the militancy of the Negro community?
Well, realism impels me to admit that if we cannot speed up the process, so to speak, if we can't move on and break down these barriers of segregation and discrimination, out of frustration and despair, many Negroes may turn to violence and other courses of action that they wouldn't ordinarily respond to, that they wouldn't ordinarily use as a technique. And I think there is an urgency about the situation. And I think if the nonviolent movement is not supported, and if there are not attempts made at every hand to give support to those who are trying to work out something through the creative channel of nonviolence, then it may open the door for extremist groups to come in and really take over to the point that they will serve as the outlet for many Negroes who become desperately impatient.
Mr. King, we've been led to believe that the president is preparing a civil rights message, proposing new legislation. If this legislation is watered down or insufficient for the Negro purposes, or it is killed in filibuster in the Senate, what would be the aftermath, in your opinion, among the Negro people in this country?
I think the aftermath would be a deeper frustration, a deeper discontent, which would inevitably lead to deeper bitterness on part of many Negroes. And with this kind of bitterness emerging, it can develop into a very explosive situation. I mean, explosive in terms of violence, and I think it can lead to a darker night of terror.
Dr. King, are you optimistic about the effectiveness of the upcoming message? Will it, in your view, in terms of the political insight you have, will it be sufficient in its in what it asks of the Congress? And are you also optimistic about passage of whatever is proposed?
Well, I think the bill will be a fairly strong bill if it follows what has been reported in the press. I do think we need something like the kind of public accommodations bill, which would prohibit discrimination in any business that is engaged in interstate commerce. I think this is good, and it would do a great deal to end segregation in many of the hotels and restaurants and other businesses throughout the South. And I think there is a great need to speed up the process of public school integration. As I said a few minutes ago, this has really been a frustrating and a very slow process, and something has to be done. Now, if the bill calls for a speed up in the integration process in the schools, I think this will be very good and very helpful. Now, as far as the possibility of passage, I am not optimistic about it passing if certain things aren't done to bring the necessary moral and creative pressure to bear so that congressmen will see the necessity of this. For instance, I think, as I said a few minutes ago, the president himself must more than issue a call, make certain recommendations.
What would you recommend he do, Dr. King? A fireside chat on it?
I think so. I think he should give fireside chats on it, and I more than one would be necessary. I think the president should also have conferences with congressmen and get them, try to persuade them to see the necessity of passing this bill. And I think he would need to talk with certain groups across the country so that it will create a climate of civil rights concern will be created. And people all over the country will be writing their senators and their representatives in Congress on this issue. I think these things are absolutely necessary. And I think the devotees of civil rights will have to do something. I mean, I think the civil rights leaders and all of the Negroes in the country, as well as their allies in the white community, will have to do something. And I don't throw out the idea of the necessity of a march on Washington, even sit-ins in Congress, to get this issue dramatized so much that it cannot be ignored.
March on Washington by Negroes and whites?
Yes.
All citizens?
Yes. I'm thinking now of all people of goodwill who are concerned about the American dream and the implementation of the basic principles of our democracy. And this would include Negroes and whites. I think it would have more power if it is an interracial march calling upon our nation to bring into being these just laws which will take us on a long, long way toward the American dream.
In the recent meeting between James Bowe and Lena Horne, Harry Belafonte, and other prominent Negroes with the Attorney General, the suggestion was made that the president could make a very dramatic contribution to the issue by taking the University of Alabama Negro applicants to the school himself. The Attorney General was reported to have recoiled at this idea, to have been stunned, horrified, or taken aback. Do you think the President of the United States should go to that dramatic degree by way of using moral power of his office?
Yes, I think so. I have said on several occasions in recent days that this would be the kind of meaningful act and the kind of dramatic thrust that would make it clear all over the world that we mean business. We talk about basic human rights and democracy and guaranteeing these basic rights to all citizens. And I think we have come to a point in our nation that we need this kind of moral witness on the part of the highest official and the most respected citizen in our nation. It would give a sense of hope to the Negro. It would give a sense of support to the many, many white people of goodwill, North and South, who have been working in this area. And it would do a great deal to lift the image of the United States in the eyes of the world. People of all countries who are looking and they're seeing all of these bad things. But to see this as a great moral act would do a great deal, I think, to give us a better image all over the world.
Dr. King, we must pause for just a brief moment. We'll be right back.
If you're getting cheap, have a look at M&M Direct.
Find the President of the United States to date wanting in the way in which he has used the moral power of his office, moral suasion. And if you do find him wanting, and your remarks up to this time seem to suggest that you do, what has been his motive, do you think, in holding back?
Well, I must honestly confess that the president hasn't done all that he could do and that we would like to see him do in the area of civil rights. I don't want to be unfair in my criticism. I want to say, on the one hand, the president has done some significant things in civil rights. And I think he is basically a man of genuine goodwill. not done it in the past. And of course, there is still the need to use the power of moral persuasion to a greater degree than he has in the past. This is one area where the president has not moved with a great sense of urgency.
Why has he hedged, do you think?
Well,
Political considerations.
I
Southern vote.
I think it boils down to a fear of arousing the ire of Southern congressmen, many of whom hold the leadership in basic and important committees in Congress. And it may be the president feels that his other legislative program can't get through if he makes these senators and congressmen too angry on the civil rights issue. My position has been that this issue is a basic moral issue, the civil rights issue, and that many of the Southerners are going to take a stand against the president's legislative program, other phases of his legislative program anyway. And it is better to go down taking a strong moral position than to lose out when you have hedged on a basic moral principle. And I think this is a choice before the president. He must start now making moral decisions rather than purely political decisions. And I think in the final analysis, he will be supported in the country. It's very seldom that an individual in the political world has an opportunity to do that which is morally right and politically expedient simultaneously. But I think this is one issue that is morally right on the one hand and politically expedient on the other. I think the president will discover that if he took a forthright, courageous stand on this issue, he would get great support from people all over the country, particularly in the big industrial urban areas of the North and the West, and in the final analysis, will elect the president.
Dr. King, will the coming showdown between Governor Wallace and the federal government on the admission of the two Negro students to the University of Alabama, in your view, will that lead to new violence in Alabama? There are 1,000 troops stationed there. The Negro community probably awaits the event. If Governor Wallace were to do a Governor Barnett act and attempt to prevent the entry himself physically with his troops, would that lead to an outbreak of new violence?
Well, I think there is this danger. There's a real possibility. Now, in recent days, Governor Wallace has backed up a bit, and he has gone on television calling for non-violence and calling for peace and orderliness. And how much influence this will have, I don't know. I feel now that Governor Wallace has been under so much pressure from the political power structure of the state, the economic power structure, the business leaders, and the ecclesiastical power structure. The ministers from all over have said to Governor Wallace, this is the wrong course of action. The Attorney General of the state, the Lieutenant Governor. And I think he's been under so much pressure that he may change his course of action and try to follow through on some token political promise that he made, yet at the same time try to keep violence from erupting. If this happens, it may be possible to prevent violence. On the other hand, if the governor over the next few days persists in his determination to stand in the door and place the troops, the state troopers of Alabama over against trying to block the entrance of the Negro students, and then a showdown comes between the state and the federal government, there is a danger that the violent forces of the state will become so aroused that they will result in violence and will unconsciously and consciously feel that they are aided and abetted by Governor Wallace in all that they're doing. So it's difficult to say. I think we must realize that it's a dangerous situation, and Governor Wallace has done a grave injustice not only to Alabama but to the whole nation by embarking on such an irresponsible course of action.
Dr. King, has the pressure of events and the frustration of the Negro in seeking his rights made your philosophy, your doctrine of nonviolence, more difficult to preach effectively? Within your own people, is there now a militancy that is damaging your theology of nonviolence?
Women know too much. I'm all for those that don't know too much.
Pay attention to the pitch.
No, she knows nothing.
He's actually telling us things we should have listened to.
Even a man who knows nothing about women and even less about their underwear understands the products they like.
Well, at this point, I don't think so. I must make it clear that I don't advocate a weak and a sort of complacent nonviolence. I advocate a militant nonviolence, a movement that moves on, a resistance movement that does resist, but it does it nonviolently. Now, I am as impatient as anybody about the slow pace of the desegregation process, and I feel that we've got to move on in a very vigorous, forthright, and determined manner. My only insistence is that it would be both impractical and immoral to try to make violence our major thrust, or to try to make violence a method that we will use to get to the goal of integration. And as I said, I think it's just downright impractical if one doesn't take the moral questions under consideration. Now, it is true that because of the failure of the forces of goodwill to rally around the democratic ideal and the whole process of integration, many people in the Negro community have become so impatient that they've become bitter. And it is more difficult to get over, in a situation like this, the philosophy of nonviolence. It makes the job much more difficult. When we are moving on and people see this creative outlet, it's easier for them to remain true to the nonviolent creed. But when things are slow, and even those who are leaders in the nonviolent movement are considered rabble rousers and agitators, then it does make the job much more difficult to get this philosophy over. And I would be the first one to admit that with the growth of the movement and with it rising to such astronomical proportions in terms of numbers, with all of the communities that are now rising up, it means that we're going to have to spend more time and get more hands to help us work in these communities so that we will be sure that at least we tried to get over the meaning of the whole philosophy of nonviolence.
What was your reaction to the reported reaction of Attorney General Kennedy at the meeting with Mr. Baldwin? The reports were in the New York Times and other reliable papers that the Attorney General was stunned at the extent of militancy, anger, and impatience that he found among these Negro artists. Was this an ingenuous reaction? Had he so misread the temper of the American Negro?
Well, I think this is a real possibility, and I think many white people of goodwill, many who are even fairly close to the Negro community, fail to realize the seriousness of this problem and the mood of the Negro, the impatience and the discontent of the Negro. I think that many people fail to see this, and it isn't that they are not people of goodwill. On the whole, they understand the depths and dimensions of the problem, but they just haven't been able to see this new determination on the part of the Negro, and the new determination itself has grown out of this impatience and this great discontent, so that I'm not surprised to know that some left with the conclusion that the Attorney General didn't realize this, because I've seen others who have been very concerned about the problem of racial injustice, but somehow had not been able to understand or to see this growing militancy in the Negro community.
Does the reaction of the Northern and Western Negro against de facto segregation in housing and lack of equal job opportunity contain the same elements of violence potential as we are seeing in the South today?
I think so, and sometimes even more, because in the South, the system of segregation is legal and therefore overt, and it's easier to get at it points. It's out in the open, so you can tackle it legally. You can tackle it through nonviolent demonstrations and other forces. And you can see pockets of progress here and there in the South. You can look back and say, well, a year ago I couldn't go to the lunch counters, but now we can go. A year ago I couldn't go in the hotels in this particular city, but now I can go. A year ago we could not go in the theaters, but now we can go. So you do see progress at certain levels. It's just token progress, but it can be seen. Now in the North it's different. Since segregation is not legal, it has to be subtle. It has to be covert. And because of the growing problems around this, often the Negro can only see retrogress. If he lives in a city like Detroit, he recognizes that he's about 28 or 30% of the population, and yet almost 70% of the unemployed. Because of discrimination and the fact that Negroes have been